Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2You Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2you.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to this episode, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr Ruth McKie from De Montfort University in Leicester. Ruth, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, and I'm excited to come and have a conversation today, so thank you.
Thank you. So, Ruth, let's start. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at De Montfort University, and my key area and focus of research is on climate change denial and what we call climate change obstruction, which in a sense is what actors, who are the people, what are the systems that are preventing us from addressing the big challenges around climate change.
So I'm guessing this is a fairly new thing. How long have you been in this? Because it's quite a niche area of sociology, isn't it?
So it's environmental sociology generally has been around sort of since the 1980s, so from the rise of the environmental movement from the 1970s onwards. And my specific field, particularly around climate change and climate obstruction, really emerged from the late 2000s, so early 2000s, and from then it's just exploded, particularly in response to the pressing and growing evidence of climate change and its impact that it's having on society, really. And the first sort of article or first academic work that came out was actually in 2000 on the issue of climate obstruction and people that are trying to prevent action on climate change. And that was actually written by Aaron McWright and a guy called Riley Dunlap in America. And they came together and looked and wanted to examine, well, climate change is real. Climate change is happening. There are various social problems that are emerging from the impacts of climate change and will in future. And they were like, well, we don't seem to be doing enough on it, particularly in the US. And they investigated why. So what may be the factors that are influencing that? And what they came to determine and what they came and found was that there's this, what we called organized opposition against climate change and particularly climate action, where there's a group of actors that have come together and said, we don't want to change because climate change is going to majorly uplift and uproot our ways of life, the way we go about our business day to day. And people don't want that to change. And certain people don't want that to change, particularly really powerful people, powerful groups such as the corporate sector and particularly fossil fuel industry. So they started to explore that just as sort of in the early 2000s. But since then, as climate change has got really, it's becoming more intense, isn't it? And it's now got to a point where we can't not act, but we seem to be slowing down. So why are we slowing down? And that sort of my work continues that pathway and has done sort of for the past 6 years.
That's interesting. And that kind of makes sense how it fits in with sociology. Because, you know, when I first heard about the ideas of climate change, you'd imagine that fits more into the natural sciences rather than the social sciences. But how does sociology take a look at climate change, which might be different from the natural sciences, would you say?
Well, so sociology, and particularly environmental sociology, really it's about understanding that climate change in the real world, in the scientific way, is evident. You can see with climate modelling, for instance, but it's become what we say is politicised. So it's been constructed as a social problem. So it's become a place where you can have debate over it and debates about what to do about it. But the same way that we think about criminology and crime and debates on why crime happens and how we prevent crime, you've got those same discussions when it comes to climate change. Well, what do we need to do about it? And then once we determine what we need to do about it, you've got very different ideological perspectives that then influence that discussion. And so, like any other social problem, I guess, that we cover in sociology, climate change is now one of those and is seen as one of those.
And so I'd imagine that, for example, a fair bit of Marxism comes into the discussion. Is that right?
I would definitely say certainly. I think when we come to understand climate change and we conceptualize climate change, we can look back to the science. So you have a look at the science and you see, well, why is climate change happening? And why is the climate changed vastly over the past 100 years? And well, that's due to industrialization. But industrialization ties back to the mass production and the means of production. So you can go back to the traditional Marxian literature and those that follow from Engels and so on. And it talks about extracting raw materials from the ground to then transfer those raw materials into goods that we sell. Yeah. So we extract those goods from the ground and we put those out in the world to sell. But when it comes to climate change and the links between the means of production and climate change, we see that this is unsustainable. This has been done at this unsustainable rate, and it's caused a form of ecological disorganization. And those concepts of ecological disorganization come from some of the developments within Marxism called eco-Marxism. As a result, that sort of really generates our understanding of climate change, why climate change happens, but also why people who own the means of production do not want us to address climate change and implement climate policy, because it will affect essentially those social hierarchies, the traditional concept of the bourgeois and the proletariat. So it is very much driven for a large body, although not all researchers adopt that position, but from a large body of the literature from Marxism, and as we move now towards what's called eco-Marxism.
And what other theories do you apply to the theory then? You said not all would take that Marxist approach. So what other approaches look at the issue?
So when it comes to addressing climate change as a problem and how we try and fix climate change, we get into some fields where they become quite technologically orientated, I guess. So it means that as time moves on and as time is moving forward, we can use tech to address these solutions. And this often comes through in what we call, quite a complex, I'm going to try and break it down, complex issue of what we call ecological modernization. So as tech has advanced in line with economic growth and so on, it means that we will eventually develop technology that can actually reduce these environmental harms and protect us from climate change. So it becomes this sort of technologically centric approach to tackling climate change by combining economic growth, combining development, combining the extraction of resources to get to a point where we can then develop technology to then reduce and adapt to climate change, as well as try and mitigate its effects.
The first question I was going to ask, because this might be rummaging through other people's minds as well, is you've already mentioned there's this powerful group at the top, an organised opposition. Who is that? Who makes up that powerful group who is so opposed to even sort of any publicity to do with the issue?
This is the really interesting stuff, sort of. So when you think of what causes climate change and what has caused climate change, well, it really stems back to the oil, gas and coal sectors. And when it comes to the particular climate obstruction movement, you've got this entanglement of actors connected to fossil fuel industries. So even as early as 1957, big oil giants such as ExxonMobil, there's reports now in the media even that you might have read that they knew that there was some link between fossil fuel-based industries and climate change. And that makes a lot of money. Those industries make a lot of money by extracting the materials, those raw materials, at unsustainable rates. And from that point on, and over the next sort of 30 years, you started to get this group of actors coming together. Those companies, so those corporate companies such as ExxonMobil, Marathon Oil, together with what we call think tanks. And essentially, think tanks are what we call non-profit-like organizations where they are set up by a group of individuals and they promote discussions on key policy issues. So some famous examples that you might want to go on and read about include what we call the Heartland Institute in the USA. And what's really interesting about these think tanks is that they get donations of money. So people fund their objectives. So they fund them to create information and write about key policy issues such as climate change. And over time, you can trace the history of some of these donations. And you can see the clear links between the Koch brothers and the Koch industry funded sectors and the funding given to these think tanks. And these think tanks are disseminating what we might refer to as climate denial. So people that deny climate change or say that climate change might be good or that we shouldn't really act on climate change now, we have to pause. And then these think tanks work with other think tanks across the world. So in 2005, there was this, what we call a coalition of think tanks that operated across the world that came together under the head of what's called the Global Civil Society Coalition on Climate Change. And essentially, these think tank actors came together and would disseminate the same types of information about climate change, specifically challenging what scientists are saying. And part of that, and now some of those still exist today, some of these groups still exist today. You've got these think tanks, but you've also got what's really, really interesting is that these think tanks have came together with these big fossil fuel interested sectors to develop a media strategy. So in 1998, there was a media strategy that came out where they said this group of actors would come together and create a purposeful attempt to minimize the importance of climate change in the political sphere, the policy sphere, but also in public. And that means they then set off and started to strategize a way to get this information out to the public. And that means they needed to connect it to the media. And there's so we've got lots of discussions on the media and sociological issues around the media. And when it comes to climate change, obstruction and climate change denial, there's a specific campaign, there's a specific narrative associated with climate change that feeds into different parts of the media. So famous shows or TV channels such as Fox News, or newspapers such as the Daily Mail in the United Kingdom, have historically what we call disseminate information on climate change that is often get a sense of skepticism, denial, or just saying that we shouldn't act now. And what happens, or amongst these, is what we've got is individual climate skeptics. So people who are titled as climate scientists or experts in this topic, who are disseminating this information. And some of these experts work for research institutes that have been also funded by fossil fuel companies. And so they're spreading this message out. And what's even more interesting about this is its impact on public perceptions. So when it comes to social problems and the ways people think about how to address large social problems, it's often affected or can be impacted by the way they view media, which media outlets they view, and how the media can impact people's perceptions of a problem. And this has become really important when it comes to the public's understanding of climate change and climate action. So that's the sort of a short introduction to the entanglement of actors who are creating climate change discourse, where it's sort of presenting it as something that's debatable, that we don't necessarily have to address now, or in some cases even deny that it exists.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
So I was going to ask you, Ruth, perhaps this is a difficult question. Does anyone truly deny it, though? Or is that just a ruse? Is that just a cover-up? Does anyone truly deny that it's occurring?
You'd be surprised. I think it's
there's flat earthers, isn't there? So I'm just wondering, is it in the same sort of league?
So you've got a small segment who are essential denialists. You could put them in the category of the flat earthers. You can think about them in line with sort of conspiracy theorists. And those conspiracy theories are really quite pervasive online on platforms such as Twitter, blogs, Facebook. So those denialists, in a sense, are there. But what's really important, or as research has illustrated over time and work in this area, is that this denial doesn't seem to be working anymore. So denying the reality of climate change isn't really working. But instead, what you've got is delaying discourse. So for instance, people now, and especially in the media, so there was a recent report in a well-known newspaper in the UK. One of the arguments that they will present, and others have presented, is this idea that it's going to have real energy policy, climate policy is going to have really significant effects on the individual. So you're tasked with the job of reducing your consumption. You're tasked with the job of not flying so much. It's going to affect your energy bills, and so on. So what they do is individualize the responsibility of addressing climate change, and that then produces this sort of, I don't want my taxes to go up to address a problem that it's going to affect me more addressing this problem than it is acting on it. So it creates that sort of delay. I don't want to vote for policies that are going to affect my livelihood. And that's where the new sort of arguments are starting to manifest, where you go, well, instead of saying it's not real, well, it diverts the responsibility on the individual, how your individual life is going to be affected. Or in this case, it's often determined that it's going to get worse. You're not going to be able to do the things that you want to do. You're not going to be able to do the things that you've been used to, and you have to change your behaviours. And then what they do is they compare this with other countries. For instance, they'll say, well, why should we have to reduce our consumption in the UK when China are increasing their pollution levels? And then you get into very weird sort of geopolitical arguments. You fuel some of those arguments around, well, China's the big problem, these world powers. So it then gets into these weird geopolitical, much bigger issues outside of just climate change action. So it becomes more political in a sense.
So it kind of comes whataboutery,
Yeah.
they're worse than us kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And this is really becoming even more important when it comes to international agreements on climate change, because we're seeing climate change now as not simply an existential threat, but we're seeing it as very much a political problem rather than a scientific problem. And that plays out on international stages. So we're not going to sign an agreement here unless you do this. Or, well, we disagree with this language or the implications that we're going to have to reduce our emissions when other countries aren't going to reduce theirs, and so on. So then it becomes a game, and it becomes, it's like a stop and block. So we actually don't figure out or find a cohesive way to solve the problem. But I guess that's with the same with all social problems or key social issues about trying to resolve an issue. And I think it's even harder because it's on a global level and it's international in nature.
Yeah, just becomes a blame game, as it were.
Exactly. And it really does. And it manifests especially within times of crisis, social and economic crises, when you start to say, well, you need to reduce your emissions, and reducing emissions have been accompanied with economic growth. And when you start to say, well, we can't do this because we're not going to grow our economy, you then just get into this very politically hostile environment. And then that feeds back into the public. And then we just don't seem to be getting anywhere.
Is that what's happening then? Because of the arguments and the discussions, the argument is kind of the can that just gets kicked down the road, as it were. It just gets pushed further and further back without the activism occurring.
Certainly at a state level. So in this week, in the next couple, around Earth Day, you've got President Biden pulling together big leaders of the world to talk about climate targets. And already we know and have indications that, yes, we can do some of this, but then we're not going to do that, or we're going to have a lower level or a lower target than you for this reason. And so these sort of debates become involved. And this is not to say, however, that this plays out into every member of the public. We've got major social movements happening at the local level, even international level, where even at school kids, so the climate strike, are coming out and saying that we need to change. But how much pressure we put on key government officials when they're entangled with a sort of political project in it, I guess, becomes quite tough and feels sort of impossible sometimes, but not all the time. And I think there's another point to this, is that we're moving social movements, and social movement studies are growing, but you can see social movements live now acting, whether that be from Black Lives Matter to the climate change movement. They are trying to have an impact, and the movement is growing. But now, because this is challenging some of the key institutions in the way our countries work, our political systems work, they're becoming the force of, or the focus for then state repression or the criminalization of these protests. So despite action, social action, being there to drive change, to make good, they're setting up barriers in place to start to criminalize this type of behavior and this protest behavior, even though it's peaceful protest. And even those are stemming into the media as well. So then you get contests in the media of, well, these are eco-terrorists, they're criminals. The kids should be in school, they shouldn't be out on the streets promoting climate action. So it's a very dynamic and interesting sociological subject, but with so many caveats, so many complex parts, that you get lost in it. I could talk forever about this. So,
and I just wondered, you said, despite the blocking, if you like, there has been massive progress, and I think we'd all agree with that. So what do you think have been the major developments or progress that we've seen, perhaps in the last decade, for example?
I think in the last decade, we really have seen some movement, especially in line with the UN and the UN Climate Conference of Parties, so the Climate Change Conference of Parties, which is bringing together nations across nations and making commitments to tackling the issue of climate change. And over time, while slow, and I think many people would think these actions have not gone far enough, they have drawn the issue to the forefront. You've got the UN Environment Programme and the support of education for sustainability in schools, showing the importance of the environment and the ecological environment that we're in. And this has made serious progress, especially reaching people to look at their world, to look at their environment and what they can do to change. So there's a lot of knowledge and awareness that certainly come from these big pushes and big movements from international organizations in particular on the issue and to address climate change. So there is some positive steps, certainly some positive steps, and lots of hope to have, especially young people. Young people are the drivers now because climate change is going to affect their world more than my world and my parents' world. And they are at the forefront because they've been provided, and we are providing them with this knowledge, with tools and skills to mitigate and in future adapt to climate change.
Yeah, I live in Brighton and Hove, and it's certainly fair to say that the popularity of the marches among the young people was huge. I know obviously I haven't been able to do so much under pandemic times, but a couple of years ago, the marches and the popularity of it was massive among the school children here.
I think it's wonderful. I do think it's wonderful. So I'm not that old, but I know that when I was a teenager, I was never this politically or even critically aware of some of the issues. So back in 2008, I was 18, and 2008 really was the kicking point for some of the key climate-related programs to come in place under the UN following the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And this just wasn't going on when I was there, even though the evidence was starting with, it was there telling you that climate change was an existential threat. And now the fact that kids are out there, they're active, they're engaging with this knowledge, this science, and then showing older people that they're ready to fight. There's they're connected to the environment. They want to make sure that the world they're going to inhabit is one which they can enjoy, survive, and thrive. And I just think that is wonderful. And I also think that this should be encouraged as well. I'm very much on the high of positive social action. And I always like, when I teach and at my university, I always like to say, well, what does this make you think about? How does this make you feel? What can you do about it? And does that mean that the next time there's a peaceful protest on climate change, are you going to be there?
I agree. It's really, really positive. It really is. And perhaps we could make this the last question then. Could you tell us a little bit more about your own research into the climate issue?
So my specific research and what I'm moving towards now is to look more detail and more in depth about the internationalization of global climate change obstruction. And more specifically, there's research, while it's a niche area, there's lots and lots of research that's centered on the US and Europe on this issue. And what I'm trying to get into now and delving into is what this looks like outside of the global north or the global south, in essence. So in countries like Latin America, different parts of Africa, where there's a very different dynamic and a different way the climate issue intersects with the lives of people in those countries. And we don't really know enough about what climate change obstruction or climate change denial, how climate change is constructed as a social problem in those countries. And we're beginning to start to deduce this. We're seeing how it's not as focused on fossil fuels. There's a really big discussion around how climate policy is going to affect the agribusiness, palm oil, for instance. And so it's navigating and looking at how people that want to obstruct climate policy are operationalizing and looking there, because that has significant implications. So on food supply, to particularly the global north, energy supplies, if countries like the UK import energy from, say, Latin America, different parts of Latin America. So getting to know the nature of that in the global south. And I think part of that is and opening my knowledge and my brain to these ideas really is a part of coming and looking at things from a different way and interpreting things from somebody else's perspective, from which I have never been. I'm from Newcastle in the UK. I went to university in Newcastle, and I would never have thought to be looking at the work of environmental activists in Guatemala or Brazil. So that's where I'm going now. And I think it's going to have real implications, or this type of work is going to have real implications for starting to see, well, what are still the barriers to getting those climate solutions in place?
And to go back to what we said just before this, then it must be really encouraging from your point of view, Ruth, to see some progress, even if it's not as quick as we'd perhaps like, and also that excitement and enthusiasm amongst the youth.
I think that's really the only thing that is giving me hope, because I see that drive from young people. I used to work with students, very young children, and teenagers, and you could see their drive on these issues or their awareness on some of these changes already. And that was back 5-6 years ago. So now, knowing that this is just elevated and they're actually driving this change, gives me hope that they can be, I like to say, game changers. They can be the game changers in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. On that respect, could I ask you to give out some details? If someone wanted to get in touch to find out more about your work or follow you on Twitter, do you want to give out some details?
Yes, so you can catch me on Twitter at Ruth McKie 1. So that's my Twitter handle. Or you can drop me an email at ruth.mckie, MCKIE, at dmu.ac.uk, or you can just give me a little search on the internet, Ruth McKie, and you'll be able to find my contact details there.
Great, thank you. And the protest, the march is starting again as soon as we can as well, Ruth?
I suspect there's going to be definitely, I think, an uprising around climate movements and more social action. Once we've got through some of the more tough phases of this pandemic.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Ruth. I really, really appreciate it, and plenty of food for thought there as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's been great.
Thank you. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.